Hi everyone, in this video we're going to take a quick look at 22 Tintin albums. The Adventures of Tintin were collected after being serialized in individual volumes, often being complete adventures, in some particular cases being two-part adventures, and here we're going to take a look at all of the ones that I currently own. If you're interested in an introduction to the Adventures of Tintin, check out the What is Tintin video that should be up soon. So the reason why it's 22 and not the 24 that you can see over here, because there are a couple of these that I do not own. The first one and the last one. The last one because it's an incomplete story and I haven't been interested in something incomplete. I'm just not that much of a completionist, although I probably will take a look at it. And the first one, well, I've read it, but I don't really enjoy it, and I don't enjoy it for curiosity value, which might also be said for the second one, but I do have a copy of the second one. Anyway, we'll get started and start by skipping the first one, which is Tintin in the Land of the Soviets, and move straight on to Tintin in the Congo. So the first Tintin book that I own sequentially is Tintin in the Congo, because I don't have Tintin in the Land of the Soviets. This is Casterman's facsimile edition replicating the original printing of Tintin in the Congo, and that's the edition, and that's the only edition I have. If we look inside, we can see that early Tintin was black and white. The drawings were very, very primitive compared to what they became later. The action over here is a lot less sophisticated than what it would later become, although the art still has a lot of dynamism. The story definitely has adventure. But alongside the problematic depiction of Africa and the white man in Africa, very, very pro-colonialism, very caricaturish in its depiction of the local indigenous populations. This isn't the most pleasant Tintin to read. Neither Tintin in the Congo nor Tintin in the Land of the Soviets, which preceded it, were what Hergé really wanted to do. They were really dictated by the magazine that he was publishing Tintin in serialized form for. It was a right-wing magazine which had a anti-communist, pro-colonial, pro-European, almost fascist bent. And that's the kind of story that they wanted Hergé to tell, where Tintin would model for young boys the ideals of that magazine. However, Hergé was really interested in doing something more, and that first becomes evident in the first book that he wanted to do, where he originally wanted to send Tintin, which was to America. Tintin in America is probably the first Tintin as far as we who were growing up with Tintin was concerned, because Tintin in the Land of the Soviets and Tintin in the Congo were not published and available for us to get easily at that time. In fact, if you look at this, which is my childhood edition, you'll see that there are only 20 Tintin albums on the back over here. Congo and Soviets is missing, as is Alf Art, which was published much later. Tintin in America sees Tintin travel to the United States and actually continues a little bit of the propaganda that the magazine that Hergé was publishing in wanted. It has an anti-consumer and therefore anti-American stance to a certain extent. It shows corruption at all levels. It shows the exploitation of the indigenous people by oil tycoons. It shows the manner in which food and food processing is handled. It's quite funny, but again, a little less sophisticated than what we have gotten used to with later Tintin stories, but still a real start for Tintin. Unlike Land of the Soviets and Tintin in the Congo, Tintin over here is a much more outright heroic figure, a much more sympathetic figure, although it'll still take a few books to actually cement that. This is the Casterman edition, facsimile edition of Tintin in America, and it's very interesting to see the differences between the story as it became later redrawn and colored from the original, which again was a lot more basic, a lot less artful. Of course, there are no colors, but this was also a much larger book at 100 pages as opposed to the 64 pages which Tintin in America was later redrawn into and which became the standard for Tintin. Tintin in America was followed by Tintin Cigars of the Pharaoh, and it's interesting to note that this is not Tintin and the Cigars of the Pharaoh or Tintin in the Cigars of the Pharaoh. It's just the Adventures of Tintin, Cigars of the Pharaoh. And this started the trend of having a title that wasn't really Tintin in, although a lot of people just refer to it as Tintin and the Cigars of the Pharaoh or Tintin and the Broken Ear. There isn't any and, it's just the Broken Ear, it's just Cigars of the Pharaoh. After Tintin in America, Tintin in the Congo, and Tintin in the Land of Soviets, Tintin in or Tintin and isn't really a common title. It's got a couple of occurrences which we'll see later. Anyway, Cigars of the Pharaoh saw Tintin travel to Egypt, of course, and was also the first two-part Tintin. Cigars of the Pharaoh is technically part 1 and Blue Lotus, the Blue Lotus, is part 2. There is a clean break, however. Cigars of the Pharaoh ends the story. There are things that are raised over here. There are characters introduced over here. And there is an underlying story that continues in the Blue Lotus, but they aren't really absolutely integrated. This doesn't end on a cliffhanger the way later two-part Tintins would, where you would have to read the second one in order to get the full story. And in case you're interested, this is the facsimile edition from Casterman of Cigars of the Pharaoh, in which you can see quite a lot of differences that have come with the redrawing and coloring of Tintin. Cigars of the Pharaoh was followed by the Blue Lotus, and this is a hardcover edition. The hardcover editions are now published by Egmont. Tintin over the years has been published, of course, by Casterman originally in the French, but by a variety of companies, including the Magnet printings that were around when I was a child, and even before that, the Methuen printings. So it doesn't really make that much of a difference. The Methuen and the Magnet editions are very, very similar. Of course, the Casterman editions replicating the original printings are quite different and make for wonderful comparisons. And now you have Egmont with the hardcovers, which are probably my favorite way to read the Tintin books. It should be noted that there are also smaller editions of Tintin which have multiple stories, 3-in-1s, but I'm not a fan of them, particularly because the shrinking of the page size affects the readability of the script as well as appreciation of the beautiful art. So, Tintin and the Blue Lotus sees Tintin travel to China, following up from the storyline started in Cigars of the Pharaoh. The Blue Lotus was followed by the Broken Ear, which saw Tintin travel to South America. This again is actually a redrawn and re-edited version that we, I think, are all familiar with, or the ones that I grew up reading, of course, but I don't have a Casterman facsimile to make a comparison for the Broken Ear. Then we have The Black Island, which was a very early Tintin, but actually published in English much later than other Tintins. The reason being, The Black Island is essentially Tintin in Britain, and when Tintin became very popular in Europe, in French, the time came for it to be translated into English and published in England, and whatever the latest Tintins were at that time, it was further along the series, were being published in England and seeing success. They wanted to reprint The Black Island from its original version, but the British publishers felt that The Black Island wasn't really very accurate in the way that it depicted England and Britain. The roads and the cars and the uniforms, etc., just didn't look like England, and they felt that this needed to be redrawn in order to make it acceptable to English British audiences. That's when we had the Black Island redrawing come up, and that's the version that was published and has been popular ever since. The Black Island is probably one of my favorite Tintins. It's one of the earliest Tintins that I read and has a lot of story points as well as wonderful art details that are redrawn now that I know, that I really, really love and associate with the Adventures of Tintin.